everyone, my name is Denise. Thanks for tuning into my channel. On my channel, I talk about fascinating cases that have fascinated me throughout my entire life and left me stumped in the end. Today, we're going to be talking about a doozy. It's Jonestown, Reverend Jim Jones and the People's Temple. Jim Jones started a congregation, moved it from Indiana to California, and ultimately to South America, where it ended up mass destruction of human lives. You have heard the saying, drink the Kool-Aid, I'm sure. It's very popular. And what it means is go along with it. And that's exactly what he had his followers do. They drank poison and they died in Jonestown. And also they killed a congressman who was there to check things out and make sure everything was okay down there for the American citizens. Leo Ryan lost his life on the airstrip. But let's start at the beginning. I'm going to go through a lot of details here, and it's so fascinating, especially to me, hopefully to you as well. Jim Jones was born in 1931 in Indiana to parents who weren't too overly attentive to him. So he ended up spending a lot of time with his neighbor lady. She preached to Jim all about the Bible and all about religion, and something Jim really took to. So instead of playing kids' games like cops and robbers or tag, Jim played preacher. He would gather his neighborhood friends or his schoolmates, and he would preach to them from the Bible. Jim's goal in life was to have his own congregation, and that came to fruition for sure. He grew and he married Marceline, and together they formed the People's Temple. It started out smaller in Indiana, maybe 200 people, 300 people, but Jim preached about racial equality. He had a vision of seeing blacks and whites worshiping side by side, and socialism was his passion. And it was a noble idea, blacks and whites together worshiping, but not very common in Indiana in the 1950s and 60s. His congregation seemed somewhat normal in Indiana. But then Jim started to, his screws started to come loose. He found an article in Esquire magazine in 1962 that talked about nuclear war and the 10 safest places to be in case of a nuclear war. And one of them, the only place in the United States, it was Ukiah, California. So Jim said, that's where we're going. So he up and moved his flock, those that would go with him. Not everybody did. He moved his flock to Ukiah, California, where the People's Temple started to thrive. They had a presence in San Francisco, nearby San Francisco, and even as far away as Los Angeles. Numbers started to grow into the thousands. Jim was a master at recruitment. He knew just what buttons to push to get people to join. He had a lot of wealthy people in the San Francisco area join, and he also had a lot of poor people. Jim would send buses out around the country to recruit. He would have people that would preach to those that were listening and say, if you want to come with us, we'll feed you, we'll house you, we'll take care of all your clothing needs, and we'll get you off drugs and we'll get you off alcohol. So needless to say, a lot of people hopped the bus and moved to California. What did they have to lose? So together, Jim would hold services of thousands of people at a time. He had a massive building and he had a massive presence. And these services would last for hours and hours and hours. But this is where things kind of got a little dark, and I think Jim started to lose his mind. One thing he did was do not sleep during the services. He would have people walk up and down the aisles to make sure people weren't falling asleep because the services lasted forever. And he also would stage fake healings. He would have a plant in the audience and say, I know that you have cancer, and they would say, yes, I do, and he's going to heal them of the cancer. So he would send the woman off to the bathroom with some helpers, and she would come back cancer-free because Jim divinely removed the cancer from the woman, and the people would come out with a little tissue full of chicken livers and chicken fatty parts that were festering for days, and they would say, look, Jim expelled the cancer from this person, and they're free. A lot of people ate it up. Some people said, well, we know this isn't really true, but we'll play along, Jim. We'll play along. The People's Temple was really raking in a lot of money at this point as well. What Jim did was have the wealthy people sign over their properties, their houses. The working people signed over their paychecks. The elderly signed over their Social Security. And in return, Jim had people living communally. They were many to a house, and they would have their meals taken care of and their clothing taken care of. But they basically signed over everything to the People's Temple. So they had a lot of money right now in the coffers at the People's Temple. What Jim wanted was power. He wanted power over his flock, but he also wanted power in the world. He wanted to be known. And so he dabbled in San Francisco politics. He had a giant voting block. That's what he would tell the politicians. Look, I've got the thousands of people. If you need votes, this can sway an election. But here's what I want in return. He had powerful connections, and he wanted to be appointed. He wanted a position in government. So George Moscone, who was mayor of San Francisco, appointed Jim Jones to the Housing Commission. Jim even had his picture taken with Rosalind Carter when she was traveling around campaigning for her husband Jimmy in 1975 and 1976. So Jim wanted to be seen as a mover and a shaker. It might be important to note at this point that Jim Jones himself had not only a diverse congregation, he had a diverse family himself. He and Marcelin had one biological son named Stephen and about 3 or 4 adopted children. But Jim Jones was cheating on Marcelin left and right. He had mistresses. He was having sex with both men and women in the congregation because he said he needed it to relieve his stress, and because the people wanted so much from him, that was one way that he could give. Jim was also even arrested at one point for public indecent exposure, but the charges, because of his connections, just seemed to magically go away. Jim also started to look at himself as God. He would no longer preach Christianity, and he even at one time took the Bible and threw it down on the ground and stomped on it. Because of all this culminating, some people decided to leave the temple, and 2 very prominent members that were high in the rankings and knew a lot of Jim's secrets were Elmer and Deanna Myrtle. And they had a 16-year-old daughter who was brought up in front of the congregation and hit 65 to 70 times with a wooden paddle because she hugged someone that Jim thought was a traitor. And this was too much for them, so they left. It threw Jim into a panic, but he badmouthed the Myrtles, and he would have his members call them and write them and just harass them. But they had had enough. Other people were leaving as well, and I think Jim felt like the walls were closing in a little bit because people were talking. They were talking to journalists in the San Francisco area, and Jim, because of all of his connections, a lot of times the journalists would ignore the story, and it wouldn't go anywhere, and articles wouldn't get published. But one journalist was listening, and his name was Marshall Kilduff, and he was a San Francisco journalist, and he talked to the defectors, and he got the story about what was really going on inside the People's Temple, the conditions of living and the people having to sign over all of their properties. This was a cult, and the punishments were horrific. But at this point, people could still walk away because they were in the United States. Things are going to get much worse. Marshall Kilduff wrote an article, and it was published in New West magazine, and it was very critical of Jim Jones and the People's Temple, and it published all the things the defectors were saying. The group was growing too. And so Jim thought, I got to get out of here. I got to take my flock and go. With all of his sexual prowess too, and the fact that he was caught indecent exposure in public would get out to the news, Jim decided he was going to move his flock to Guyana. He had sent some trusted leaders to go down there and negotiate with the Guyanese government about having a plot of land down there for an agricultural project. So Guyana gave the People's Temple about 150 acres, but it was smack in the middle of the jungle, dense jungle that you couldn't go through, kind of by the Venezuela border, which is where the Guyanese government kind of wanted them, kind of like a buffer in case there was disturbances between the border. So Jim sent down some people to go and clear land and start planting crops and building cottages. And the ones that did go actually said it was a phenomenal experience. It was really hard work, but they worked together and they fed themselves well, and they made a lot of progress. And pretty soon, Jim said, well, it's time that we're going to move down there. So he went down there himself, and boy, did he put on a show, a big propaganda video.
Here are the people at the table eating an afternoon snack. You see Pepsi Cola's here for 3 cents, American money.
They would send home these home movies that they would show during church services on Sunday.
These are potato chips made from plantain, and they're more delicious. They're a combination of potato chip and a French fry. And radishes, You don't know what you're missing down here?
He was walking amongst boxes of food saying, this is all the food we have here, and we're going to live high off the hog, and this is going to be paradise for us. We're going to leave the United States where we are persecuted, and we are going to move down here and be able to be on our own with no hassles, nothing to stop us from thriving as a community, the community we were meant to be. And he'd walk around and show the cottages, and they were cute little cottages. And Jim was sending this video up to San Francisco, the Ukiah area, to say, come down here. It's paradise. Believe me, join me down here. And a lot of people did. By the hundreds, they started flocking to Jonestown in Guyana. And what happened was there was not enough food, and there was not enough housing for the influx of people, because Jim wanted to get down there fast. He wanted his entire flock down there fast. So he went down there, and before he arrived, people said it was pretty good because they weren't under his thumb. They were feeding themselves well, and they were getting enough sleep, and it was hot. The conditions were hot, and there were a lot of bugs there. So he, as soon as Jim went down, though, that all stopped. He harangued on the overhead microphone, at all times. If he wasn't speaking himself, he was playing recordings of himself talking about socialism, and everyone had to take socialism classes. And he was talking about things that just weren't true, how the United States was falling apart and they were going to go to war, and they were coming after Jonestown and the People's Temple, which just wasn't true. But he scared his followers into thinking that Jonestown was the only place they were going to be safe. Now might be a good time for me to introduce a book that I loved. It was by Debbie Layton, and it was called Seductive Poison. She was a high-ranking member in the People's Temple, and of course Jim had sex with her, but she went down there with her mother, her elderly mother, and they thought they were going to paradise and a utopia. And when she got there, she was shocked at how awful the conditions were, and she lays it all out in her book. So she flew with her mother to the Georgetown, where the People's Temple had a house that was their Georgetown presence. They had a radio room there, and then you had to get on a boat for 24 hours to go around in the water to head over to Guyana, and then you got in a truck. Port Kaituma was where you landed. It was a tiny little town, 7 miles from Jonestown. Then you got in a truck and you took a 7-mile drive, very bumpy, to get into the actual People's Temple. But I just wanted to lay out a couple of things that Debbie Layton said in her book that was terrible about Jonestown. Upon arrival, all letters from the outside loved ones are confiscated. So loved ones trying to get a hold of their loved ones in Jonestown, their letters of concern were first read through before they were given to anybody actually on the inside. All items were to be collected, medicines, everything, clothing for communal use. Debbie Layton noticed right away that there was severe overcrowding. They had one big giant dormitory with bunk after bunk after bunk after bunk where a lot of the elderly people were staying. People were encouraged to tell on each other. If you said anything negative about the conditions, or if you said anything negative about Jim Jones or the what was going on, people would tell on you, and then you would be brought before the congregation and physically beaten and berated and just made fun of. And it was just awful. Public beatings were common, she had said. When arrived, she said everyone looked sad and withdrawn, and they would just kept their heads down. They were worked to death in the fields. It was the growing condition. Remember, this was a jungle. The growing condition wasn't that good, and it was hard to get these crops to grow. And people worked from 6 in the morning till 6 at night, and the food was scarce. It was rice covered with gravy, and for breakfast you have a piece of bread covered with syrup. It was just not enough to sustain the hard conditions that these people were working in. And then he'd have long nights of meetings in the pavilion. So after work, it wasn't enough that you could go. There's hardly any showers. You get a bucket of cold water poured over you, and you couldn't just go lay down in your bunk. No, you had to go listen to Jim talk on and on and on. Jones at this point also was on a lot of drugs. He drugged himself up to keep himself going during the day and helping him sleep at night, to the point where he was slurring his words. He looked puffy and he just looked like sickly. I don't know why someone just didn't incapacitate him, but he had a lot of loyal people watching out for him. It was hot and the bugs were out of control. At one point, Deborah Layton couldn't even put her boots on because she had such blistering bug bites that itched like crazy. Here are a couple of punishments for the children. The children that misbehaved were put in a box, which was like a 4 by 6 foot box underground and kept there for days. And there was a well they would dip people into. Lots of people were put in the box, but the well was saved for the children. They would be dangled upside down and dunked in water in this well. I can't believe people would put up with this, that the children would be put through this kind of punishment for being just kids. So Deborah Layton planned her escape. It was harrowing. She made it by the skin of her teeth. She went basically to Georgetown to accompany a kids' youth group. Jim liked to maintain on the outside that things looked normal, that everything was great in Jonestown. Look, our children have been practicing for a performance that they're going to be doing in Jonestown. Well, Debbie Layton got to accompany them, and that's when she planned her escape. All the details are in the book. It's fascinating. But basically, long story short, she went to the U.S. Embassy and told the consulate there the conditions and what was going on in Jonestown. And she needed an emergency passport because, the passports and all your identification was confiscated the moment you stepped into Jonestown. So Deborah Layton escaped back home to the United States, sadly without her mother, but she felt she had no choice but to get out and try and do something about this. So she went to the government officials and she said, look, this is what's happening in Jonestown. She wrote a 37-page affidavit outlining all of her concerns. And one of her concerns also was that Jim Jones would hold white nights. And what those are is the sirens would start blaring at any time during the night when you're trying to sleep after all your hard work. And it meant get to the pavilion, the guards with guns. There was armed guards that were all surrounded Jonestown, so nobody tried to escape through the jungle. And the armed guards would go make sure everyone left their little cabin and went to the pavilion, where Jones would talk about the fact that now is the time that they needed to take action, and it was going to be revolutionary suicide. And it was just a drill. It was just practice. And Deborah Layton said, I think he's practicing in case someday he actually goes through with it. So she also was a defector. And when Jim found out, again, it drove him crazy that people would actually leave, and then he would say that they're just going to badmouth me and tell lies. They're going to tell lies about us. But the defectors got the attention of Congressman Leo Ryan, and he represented the San Francisco, Ukiah area where a lot of the concerned relatives lived. And finally he said, okay, I will get a delegation together and I will go down to Jonestown and check on your loved ones for you. Because also after Debbie Layton defected, she went to the press and articles were being written, and this was becoming a big story. So Leo Ryan was going to go check it out. And he was accompanied by his assistant, Jackie Spear, and he was accompanied by a lot of journalists. Don Harris from NBC, along with his cameraman, Tim Reiterman, who was a journalist, and a few others who went with him. And they flew to Georgetown, and they tried to get into Jonestown. And at first, Jim Jones said, no, you're not getting in here, especially since they were accompanied by Tim and Grace Stowen. They were also defectors, and Tim was a lawyer for the temple, and Grace was a high-ranking member, and they had a little son named John together. And Jim made Tim sign papers that said that Jim Jones was the actual father, not Tim himself, which Grace has said Tim Stone is the father of John. But where's John? He is down in Jonestown with Jim Jones, and the Stowens wanted him back. They wanted him out. They were accompanying Leo Ryan, and Jim Jones said, you can come in, you can bring the journalists, but Grace and Tim Stowen are not to come in. They need to stay in Georgetown. And those were the conditions, and so they said yes. So Leo Ryan and the journalists went to Jonestown to visit. And oh, was it time to put on a big show. It got cleaned up. Jonestown got cleaned up. The food was significantly better. And they actually had a party in the pavilion. They had live music playing for the journalists to take video of, and for Leo Ryan to do a speech that said, a lot of people like it here. I can see that.
I'm very glad to be here. This is a congressional inquiry. I think that all of you know that I'm here to find out more about questions that have been raised about your operation here. I can tell you right now that from the few conversations I've had with some of the folks here already this evening, that whatever the comments are, there are some people here who believe that this is the best thing that ever happened in their whole life.
But there were cracks that were starting to form. The next morning, the journalists went around, the cameramen went around, and they wanted to take pictures of the dormitories and the living conditions of people just crammed, a lot of people crammed into one little small space. But the real turning point came when Vern Gosney and Monica Bagby together must have been in cahoots, because you're not supposed to talk to anyone about your true feelings. They wanted out of Jonestown, and they slipped a note to one of the journalists that said, please get us out of here. And Leo Ryan saw it, and he went to Jim Jones and he said, here's a note. These people want to leave. Anybody who wants to leave Jonestown now, he made an announcement, can leave with me now. And of all the people that were there, over 900, about 20 came forward. The Parks family came forward. They wanted to leave Jonestown. Those numbers aren't very big, but it was enough to throw Jim Jones over the edge. So Ryan ordered another plane, and he said, anyone who wants to leave with me now can get on the plane with me. We'll get on the truck. We'll go over to Port Kaituma and load the planes. Not before a temple member attacked Leo Ryan with a knife. He actually, in a struggle to get the knife away from the attacker, some members were struggling with him. The attacker was actually cut, but Leo Ryan had blood on his shirt, and it just was a scary look for everyone involved. And Leo Ryan said, I better get myself on the first plane out of here, but everybody who wants to go can go. All hell broke loose that morning. Families were torn in two. Some of the concerned relatives were there begging their loved ones to come back with them, but they wouldn't. A lot of people remained loyal to Jim Jones. So they got on the truck and they took that 7-mile journey over to the airstrip where some little planes were waiting. But also what was waiting was death for Leo Ryan. As they were pulling up and talking about boarding the planes and doing a quick interview about what was happening, a truck from People's Temple pulled up behind them and got out, and they started to shoot everybody down. And Leo Ryan was shot and killed along with 5 others on that airstrip. Don Harris, NBC News reporter, was shot dead along with his cameraman. Tim Reiterman was shot, but he was not injured. Jackie Spears almost lost her life in that shooting. She played dead on that airstrip. In a small plane, Vern Gosney and was sitting with some of the Parks family in a small plane, and Larry Layton, who is actually Deborah Layton's brother, was so loyal to Jim Jones that he pretended to be a defector. He pretended to want to leave, and he had a gun, and he shot people in the plane. So Vern Gosney was shot, but he actually lived. He was shot in the stomach. So that's what was happening on the airstrip. Total death and destruction. A bit of trivia for you. The only U.S. congressperson to ever die in the line of duty to this day was Leo Ryan. Back at Jonestown, Jones came over the loudspeaker and he made an announcement. And he said, the congressman is dead. The journalists are dead. And now is the time for our revolutionary suicide. And he ordered his followers to make the vat of Flavor Aid. It wasn't Kool-Aid, it was Flavor Aid mixed with cyanide. A giant vat of it was there. And there's tapes of Jonestown, the chaos that was breaking loose at this moment. People were begging him. I thought maybe we talked about going to Cuba. I thought maybe we talked to going to Russia. Why do we have to do this? We don't want to do this. And he said, we're going to do it. Just come forward and take the poison, and you will cross over to the other side together, and it will be beautiful. And the children went first.
The children, it's just something to put you to rest.
Oh, God.
The children had a syringe of the mixture squirted into their mouths. Jones wanted the children to go first to make sure that the parents would follow. So what the parents had to do was see their children go into convulsions and seizures, foam at the mouth, eventually have trouble breathing, and go into cardiac arrest. That's what cyanide did to you over a few minutes. And Jones was watching the children die. Then the parents stepped up, and then Jones was watching the parents die, and there was screaming and begging. And some people tried to run, but remember, there was armed guards around the perimeter that made sure nobody could escape into the jungle. And those who did try to escape were chased down with syringes, and they were given the mixture against their will. So that is what I would call murder. As people were dying all around Jim Jones, he took the cowardly way out. He didn't want to suffer like his followers did, so he either shot himself in the head or he had somebody shoot him in the head, but that's how he died ultimately. A few people did survive Jonestown while they were there. Hyacinth Thrush was 76. She hid under her bed. And Odell Rhodes, Grover Davis, and Stanley Clayton somehow managed to slip by the guards and out into the jungle. And they survived to tell their story. So Stephen Jones and his adopted brothers were actually in Georgetown for a basketball tournament. Remember, Jim liked to keep the facade of everything being normal. So look, we have a basketball team here in Jonestown. So Stephen Jones was in Georgetown, when this whole thing was going down. And I've seen a lot of documentaries where Stephen Jones was interviewed. And one of the things that he said that was so sad and haunting was he was the only one that could stand up to Jim Jones and get away with it. And he wonders if he had been there that day, could he have stopped it? He thinks about that. I'm sure it haunts him. The books I've read about Jonestown are numerous, and some of them are so I don't even remember what they were like because it's been years and years. I do know this one was by Marshall Kildoff, the journalist who actually broke the story in New West Magazine and started that whole ball rolling. This one I highly recommend, by Deborah Layton. It tells you of life in Jonestown and what it was truly like. And then there's Raven by Tim Reiterman. He was also on the airstrip that awful day in November 1978. He wrote a book called Raven, and it is such a good read. It details so much about Jim Jones, starting from the very beginning and going all the way through to the end. So I would highly recommend that book. So what happened to Jonestown? The jungle took it over. Initially, after the bodies were collected by the government officials, they found body laying on top of body, layers of body, ultimately over 900 people they found. So the numbers kept creeping up as they kept finding more. But the officials came in and cleared away Jonestown, and then the indigenous people took it over for a while. I think eventually it was burned, and that's when the jungle really took it over. Somebody visited recently and took video of what's left there, and you find little pieces of metal, and I think the vat is all rusted, but I do believe it's still there. Maybe even that truck that took people back and forth from Jonestown to Port Kaituma. So what fascinates me and stumps me about Jonestown? I'm fascinated by the fact that this cult had so many loyal people, even after witnessing Jim Jones do these awful things to people they loved. They stayed with him. They were afraid to leave, especially in California. They could have just walked away. In Jonestown, there was no escape, so I can see there how they would just be just so sad, and they didn't even care what their future looked like. What stumps me is the fact that they could stay and witness things being done to the children. And I'm stumped that somebody didn't stop Jim Jones. He was drugged out the way it was. Why didn't somebody do something? I think it's because he had too many loyal followers too, and he had so many people brainwashed that Jonestown was the right place for them. But yeah, to this day, there's lots of documentaries and books you can watch about Jonestown. It's a fascinating, dark chapter in our history. Thanks for watching so much. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. That will help me out. And I'll have more coming on fascinating cases that leave me fascinated and stumped. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.